Another who should be mentioned. For those who remember him, he's definitely the performer who gave the matches a national following and a certain air of dignity. Gorgeous George.
He may have had the heart of a roughneck, but he had the soul of a poet. He brought a fresh, new aroma to his sport. If he stuck a thumb in your eye, it was not a dirty, unmanicured thumb. This man was fastidious. He was gorgeous. He was Gorgeous George. He was the Liberace of the leg lock. But of course, Gorgeous George is just the full flower in the evolution of wrestling, a sport that goes back to the dawn of time. Men have always wanted to clutch and clobber each other, and perhaps the first two were those grapplers, Cain and Abel, Crusher Cain and Abel the Animal. Maybe that was the billing back in the original garden, Eden Square Garden. The Sumerians, 5,000 years before Christ, were wrestling. The Greeks had a word for it, polema, and polema, or wrestling, was included in the original Olympic Games. No country or culture has escaped wrestling. The old Trojan, Laocoon, the first gimmick, tag team against a snake. Henry VIII, His Highness the Hulk, was a wrestling fan, and of course, he liked to watch heavyweights. American Indians were well-versed in wrestling by the time Columbus landed, and the old rail splitter, Abe Lincoln, was a head splitter back in his youth in New Salem, Illinois. He beat a guy named Jack Armstrong and won $10. His biographer, Carl Sandburg, put it this way: Lincoln picked him up by the neck, waved him like a rag, and threw him down to a hard fall. Now, if Lincoln were still around, he could wrestle as Honest Abe against Jefferson Dixie Davis. It would be good against evil, depending on where you live. Abe Lincoln was a serious true blue amateur, but not long after, professionals in theatrics began to turn up. Such men as One-Eyed Tom Jenkins, William Muldoon, Joe Stecker, Frank Gotch, who may have given us the gotcha, and Strangler Lewis, the original. In the 1920s, another Strangler Lewis had come along, a great big hairy-chested man with a tattoo on his chest. An Ivy League education was essential in the introduction of a revolutionary tactic, the flying tackle by a former Dartmouth football player, Gus Sonnenberg. And sometimes Gus did make the tackle. At the pinnacle in the 1930s was that craggy peak of ugliness, Man Mountain Dean. Ugh. Kamikazes had no effect. George Zaharias, who later married Babe Dietrichson, survived this chop. Don't interfere. But, ooh, sometimes the bouncers get bounced and the mountain disappears into the mist. The 30s, an age of weirdness, wrestling in cages, in mud, and here a tag team match against fish. Halibut that. Sorry, no piranha. Perhaps even stranger was the wrestler from France, the Angel, who caught up with his long-lost brother. After the war came television, dominated by Milton Berle and wrestling. Which was more hilarious? Well, Steve Allen was around then, actually as a wrestling announcer. What made the greatest impression on him?
Well, of course, everyone, I think, at least of that general age bracket, remembers Gorgeous George. He was one of the very first to wear long hair, the kind that became common enough in the 60s. But this was back in the 40s when men did not wear long hair. Nevertheless, if you're, 300 pounds, you can wear any kind of hair you want. Then another guy that I got to know a little better was named Baron Leone, Baron Michael Leone.
Oh, yes, yeah.
And he was, or would have been, had he worked in an earlier medium, a great star, I think, of silent films, because he worked mostly pantomime. Before the bout started, he would go over to the referee and, all in pantomime, inquire if it might be permissible during the proceedings, and then he would grab the referee's arm or something, might be permitted to fling his opponent not only out of the ring, which has happened now and then, but to the topmost reaches of the stadium, like up in the 48th row. And the referee, of course, would say, no, none of that. And the guy would go, well, then to hell with it. I'll just have to wrestle as best I can.
Beautiful or beastly, they fought. Nature Boy, Mr. America, Dick the Bruiser. But in the 1950s, a man who sold out Madison Square Garden time after time, Antonino Rocca. High fives with your hands is easy. Rocca did it with his feet. Perhaps the first Italian stallion was Primo Carnera, making a comeback in wrestling after holding the heavyweight boxing title in 1933. Killer Kowalski, noted for the claw hold, takes it on the chops from Australian Pat O'Connor. O'Connor would mug anybody, including this announcer you know. 25 years ago, at the pinnacle of his broadcasting career, before descending to the electronic bullpen, he learns the true meaning of upset.
And now I can't get up.
Joe Garagiola, I know what you mean. I've often wondered what it would be like to be swept away in a monsoon.
Well, you don't have to wonder about it anymore.
Gorilla monsoon. A 400-pound student at Ithaca College, Robert Morella, emerged as the Manchurian Giant, Gorilla Monsoon. Mr. Monsoon, who would you consider the giants of wrestling during your era?
Well, Bud, you know, it's San Martino undoubtedly has to be the greatest individual to ever hold a championship in the sport of professional wrestling. He did over a 15-year period what no man will ever accomplish again in my eyes. He held the title for 8 years straight. The worst time for San Martino was in Madison Square Garden. He wasn't wrestling me. He was wrestling a fellow named Stan Hansen, and he broke his neck. Early in the match, didn't even realize it, broke his neck. Continued on the match another 10 or 15 minutes. He knew he was hurt, but the seriousness of the injury, of course, he didn't know. They said that an individual could never come back from that type of injury, and here's a guy who did come back.
Just about 10 years ago, you had a confrontation with Muhammad Ali, the heavyweight champion at the time. What went on?
He had signed a match maybe just a week before to wrestle a Japanese wrestling star, Antonio Inoki, in Japan, as boxer opposes wrestler. And I guess in his own mind, he figured, let me go down to the arena and see what I got myself into. And he jumped around the ring and took a few jabs at me and talking to me constantly. I don't know what he was trying to accomplish. When he got close enough, I grabbed him, put him up in an airplane spin, gave him a nice ride, and dumped him onto his behind. At which point I could have done anything to the individual. You know, I could have maimed him or anything I wanted to do, but he certainly got a negative attitude about wrestling.
Good times, bad times. There's never been a time without wrestling, so you must remember this. It's still the same old story, a fight for blood and glory, a case of pin or die. The world will always welcome wrestlers as time goes by.